Hello, my name is Emily, and today we're going to talk about watercolor blending. Blends are just soft and gentle transitions between tones in watercolor, whether that's from a dark shade to a light shade or blending one color into another color seamlessly. Learning how to blend effectively in watercolor is so essential because by its very nature, watercolor tends to want to form hard edges. So in today's example, I have this adorable photo of a calf that I took myself, and you can see in his sunlit, beautiful little face, there's lots of opportunities for blending your edges. So we'll be using wet on wet and wet on dry, and I'm going to show you in a real painting all these different ways that you can achieve soft blends to help your next watercolor painting be successful. Really quick, let's talk about our supplies for this project. I am using a Blick watercolor block. This is size 7 by 10 inches, cold pressed, 100% cotton. It's made in England. It's amazing paper. And I'm also using my Blick painter's tape. It's just a 1/2 inch, and it's really great because it doesn't lift up with lots of water, but it also doesn't rip the paper. My paint colors today are by my Mary Blue. I'll be using ivory black, cobalt blue, quinacridone magenta, burnt sienna, and primary yellow. My Mary Blue colors are amazing because they're single pigment colors, which makes for purer mixes. My brushes are Princeton Aqua Elite brushes. This is a round size 4, and this one is a round brush size 10. I also have my water jars and a sponge for blotting and for water control. So this tutorial is going to be emphasizing different ways to blend your watercolor paints. Something that can be a little tricky when you're first starting with watercolors is how to get those really soft and gentle transitions between colors and values. Now you might be wondering, okay, I know what the wet and wet technique is, I know what the wet on dry technique is, but when do I use those? And generally, I like to use the wet on wet technique for blending when it's a larger area because it allows my paper to stay wet longer and I don't have to scramble to paint really quickly. So with that in mind, I'm going to use the wet and wet technique for my first layer on the calf, and I'm beginning with my size 10 round brush with clean water, and I'm just going to go ahead and wet everywhere inside of the calf. Now from the angled view here, you can see the paper will be glossy and shiny and just damp, not soaking with puddles necessarily, but wet enough so that when we apply some paint, our paint will just kind of spread out naturally across the surface of the paper. Wherever your water is, your paint will flow. So keep that in mind. And that's something that can come in handy if you want to have lost edges where the paint just sort of disappears into the background. And I'll show you that here on the calf's ear, in fact. I'm going to extend the water a little bit beyond my pencil line for the calf's ear right here. And that will allow for a softness where the paint will spread out. So you can see, because we're working on such a big area, it would be almost impossible to try to fill this in with paint as quickly as we can and still maintain soft edges. So that's why working with pre-wet paper will buy us more time and allow us to get down color faster with soft blends. Okay, so you should have a nice shiny surface. I'm just gonna take my ivory black. I'm mixing in a little bit of blue. In the reference photo, you can see he's got kind of a blue sheen to his black coat. So some cobalt blue mixed right in. We're gonna drop that in. And you wanna make sure that your brush is fully loaded with paint. One mistake a lot of beginners make is just to simply not use enough paint. And because we've pre-wet the surface, it is softening out and blending naturally on the paper. You do want to watch out for areas that are going to be in the light, such as in the center of the face, and maybe not completely cover that. And so you can see now I have a lighter value on my brush, and I'm going to use that in the center of the face, where we have those lighter values, and then continuing to grab more dark paint anywhere I can get away with darker colors. And you want to work fairly quickly. Now here along that ear where we let the water extend past the ear, you can see when I apply the paint, we get a really fuzzy edge there. It just naturally fuzzes out and it looks just like soft calf fur, and we didn't even have to really do anything. The paper and the paint did it for us. So the wet and wet technique is really my favorite technique for blending. I use it all the time, and it's an essential skill to learn if you're going to paint with watercolors. Right under the head, there's a really strong shadow, so I'm just dolloping on more paint there. It's so nice that when you have pre-wet the surface, the blends happen naturally. Now I'm going to show you an example of 2 colors blending side by side using wet and wet. So now I'm going to reach for my burnt sienna, mixing in a little of that black combo, and I'm going to start dropping that in where I see more of this brown on the cow's body. And I'm just laying it in between my blue black, and you can encourage that to kind of blend by feathering your brush a little bit as it approaches the blue-black, but don't overwork it. This is where a lot of us make the mistake of futzing with the edges too much, especially in these initial washes, and just trying to force the blend. And you don't have to do that, and it doesn't look the best when you try to do that either. So you should never be battling with your paint. And look at how smoothly that blended without us having to manually scrub anything. And that's just the beauty and magic of wet on wet. So we will let that dry all the way, and then I'm going to show you a couple other techniques for blending. Okay, with that first layer dry, I'm now going to show you areas of the cow's face where I'll be using some wet on dry blending, or more of a forced blending technique. And this technique is something I use for smaller areas in a painting, especially when it comes to the delicate anatomy of an animal's face. I'm going to start with this left side of the head right here where there's some contrasting dark and light areas. And even though there is contrast there, I want to make sure that those edges are really soft because we are trying to represent a soft furry creature. So I have a really dark brown, almost a sepia color. And with that, I'm going to paint the base of the ear right here. And so you can see just how thick and creamy this paint is, and how as soon as I put it on dry paper, it really doesn't do anything. It just stays put. This is one of the most intuitive ways for us to paint, but if you want soft edges in watercolor, it's not the answer, because as you can see, watercolor by its very nature will form hard edges. So this is where we have to use these different techniques to manipulate the paint and get it to do what we want it to do. But now let's talk about how we can soften the edge of some of these little shapes that I'm dropping in. Some of the little dips and anatomical features of the face right here, all very hard and harsh, right? So what I'm going to do now is dip my brush in the water without completely removing all the paint. I should have just a very light value of that same color in my brush, and I dry my brush on the sponge before going back in, but it's not completely dry. It's still sort of damp. You can see it has a light tint on it now, and I'm taking the edge of that shape, pulling it out and away, and so this is creating a softer transition from dark value into light value. And here's another area where I want to soften that transition. So gently swiping with a clean damp brush, or cleanish damp brush, next to the area where you laid down your hard-edged paint will soften that transition, creating those soft edges without using the wet and wet technique. You're essentially pulling that paint along, and this does require continuing to clean your brush, dry your brush, and go back in with a lighter value. And the danger here is potentially introducing too much water into that area, causing some blooms or help washing it out too much. So always be aware of how much water is in your brush. It should just be damp, not soaking wet. So you can see how blending with a smaller brush and with a wet and dry technique works really well for the small areas in the anatomy of the cow. And in the larger areas, because we need to work quicker, we're going to use bigger brushes and use the wet and wet technique. With the first layer completely done, I can now continue to use these two techniques, wet and wet and dry, to finish my painting, working in multiple layers. As you can see, when I work in larger areas like the solid shape of the head, I use wet on wet and big broad washes of color. And then when I'm working in the smaller details like the eyes and the shadows on the side of the head, the ears and the nose, and all of that soft fluffy fur in the middle of the head, I use more wet on dry, using a delicate scrubbing motion to soften and blend those edges out. For the body, which is a much larger area, I can get away with using a bigger brush, more wet on wet techniques, and dropping in thick creamy paint side by side to create those soft blends between the dark black fur and the areas of brown fur once again. And then once that's dry, you can go over the whole thing with wet on dry layers to add dark details that you know will stay put. And there we go. There's our finished calf. I hope this one was helpful with lots of different blending techniques for you today. If you're still struggling with blending, definitely practice on some cheap watercolor paper. Don't try to just dive into a really complicated painting and expect your blends to work. Practice on spheres, practice on squares, practice on just simple shapes on scrap pieces of paper, and get comfortable with how wet your paper needs to be and how wet your brush needs to be, because those are going to be the key factors in achieving successful blends. Learning how to blend will not happen overnight. point, make sure you're painting as often as you can. The more you log your brush miles, the more you play with your paint, the easier it will get. I hope this video was helpful. Thank you so much for watching.